Have you ever wondered why, despite all our advancements, so many of us feel empty? Why is it that even in a world connected by satellites, social networks, and instant messages, our hearts feel lonelier than ever? You see it in the hurried faces on crowded streets, in the dull glow of screens late at night, in the way people seem to move through life like ghosts, present in body but absent in spirit. We live in an age of abundance. Everything is faster, shinier, more convenient. And yet, something essential is slipping through our fingers. Not long ago, in a small town surrounded by old trees and dusty roads, there lived an elderly man. Every morning, before the sun had fully stretched its arms across the sky, he would stand by the roadside, right where the path met the forest. He had no wealth to his name, no titles to claim, but he carried something precious, something we've long forgotten. He would raise his wrinkled hand and wave at every passerby, whether it was a merchant rushing to market, a child chasing a dog, or a soldier returning from battle. His face, carved with time, always held the same gentle, unshaken smile. At first, people ignored him. Some thought he was mad. A few even mocked his simplicity. But day after day, year after year, he stood there, offering kindness to the world, expecting nothing in return. And something strange began to happen. The townsfolk started waving back. The merchant, once bitter and cold, softened. The child stopped to ask for a story. Even the hardened soldier, carrying the weight of unspeakable things, found himself pausing, if only for a moment. What power did this old man possess? What secret allowed him to remain so steady in a world so restless? It wasn't magic. It wasn't wealth. It was a heart rooted in four timeless qualities: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. The Buddha called them the Four Immeasurables, four boundless states of mind, meant to stretch far beyond the limits we place on our hearts. Qualities not reserved for monks in monasteries or saints in distant lands. No, these were meant for all of us, every single imperfect, stumbling one of us. And yet today we hardly speak their names. We've traded compassion for competition, joy for jealousy, kindness for coldness, and equanimity, replaced by endless waves of anxiety, anger, and restlessness. It's easy to see how we got here. The world pulls us in every direction. Fear sells, outrage trends, the economy runs on our insecurities. Even our moments of peace are interrupted by notifications begging for our attention. But beneath all of this noise, there's a quiet place inside you, a place untouched by praise or blame, wealth or loss. A steady flame you might have forgotten, but it never forgot you. The Four Immeasurables aren't just Buddhist philosophy. They're ancient, universal truths about the nature of human happiness. Not the kind you buy, but the kind you become. Loving kindness softens the sharp edges of our world. Compassion teaches us to feel the weight others carry. Sympathetic joy reminds us that another person's happiness isn't a threat to ours, it multiplies it. And equanimity gives us the grace to remain steady amid life's chaos. Imagine for a moment if we lived this way. If you, waking tomorrow, chose to wish genuine happiness for a stranger. If, when wronged, you responded not with revenge but with understanding. If instead of envying a friend's success, you celebrated it as if it were your own. Small things, yes, but small things repeated daily reshape destinies. This is the forgotten wisdom. A wisdom so powerful, it could calm 1,000 storms, heal ancient wounds, and reconnect us to the parts of ourselves we abandoned somewhere along the way. The old man by the road didn't have a sermon to preach or scriptures to recite. He didn't need them. His life was the sermon, his kindness the scripture. And while the world may have passed him by, those who noticed felt something rare, a moment of real human presence in a sea of indifference. Today we have a choice: to continue down this path of division, detachment, and quiet desperation, or to remember, to reach into the past, dust off these ancient, beautiful teachings, and carry them forward in new, brave ways. Not through perfection, not through grand gestures, but through 100 small acts of boundless heart. And so this journey begins, not to escape the world but to meet it fully, to rediscover a way of being that transforms not just ourselves, but every life we touch. For in the end, the measure of a life isn't what we built or won or conquered. It's how we loved, how we held one another through darkness and dawn, how we cultivated a heart so vast, so immeasurable, it left the world just a little softer than before. Let's begin there. There's a kind of power in this world that doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention or force its way to the front. It moves quietly, like the first light of dawn spilling softly over the horizon. It's gentle, and yet it has the strength to break open even the hardest heart. This is the power of loving kindness, what the ancient Buddhists called Metta. And though its name might sound old, its truth is more relevant now than ever. You see, most of us confuse love with transaction. I'll love you if you love me. I'll care for you if you make me feel special. I'll be kind if you deserve it. But Metta is different. It isn't a trade. It isn't earned. It isn't a prize for good behavior. It's the quiet wish for others to be truly happy. No strings, no conditions, no scorekeeping. Picture it like this: a candle doesn't decide who deserves its light. It simply shines. It offers warmth, whether you're a king or a beggar, a friend or a stranger. That's Metta. But how often do we let that light dim? We lock our hearts away in armor built by disappointment. We convince ourselves it's safer not to care. We scroll past suffering because we're too exhausted, too distracted, too numb. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there's a part of you that longs to remember, to step outside the coldness of transaction and rest in the warmth of simple, unconditional goodwill. The Buddha taught that loving kindness begins like a tiny seed. You plant it first within yourself, not out of selfishness, but because you can't give what you haven't cultivated. May I be happy. May I be safe. May I be free from suffering. It's not arrogance. It's permission. Permission to stop waging war against yourself. Permission to recognize that beneath all your flaws, mistakes, and regrets, you are worthy of peace. And once that seed takes root, you extend it outward, first to someone you love easily. May they be happy. Then to a neutral person. Then to someone difficult. And finally to all beings everywhere without exception. The old texts describe Metta as boundless, without limit. It isn't confined by nationality, belief, or species. The bird nesting in the tree, the ant beneath your feet, the enemy you cannot forgive, all included. Now let's be honest, this isn't easy. We live in a world where tenderness is mistaken for weakness, where it's safer to stay guarded, cynical, detached. But consider this. What if it's not tenderness that makes us weak, but the walls we build to avoid it? What if real strength is a heart that can remain open, even when it's been broken? There's a story about a monk who meditated on loving kindness for years. One night, a thief broke into his humble hut. The monk, undisturbed, looked up and said, "You may take whatever you need, but please leave the candle. The night is dark and you might hurt yourself." The thief, startled by this unexpected kindness, dropped his loot and fled. But something in his heart shifted. A crack appeared in his anger, wide enough for light to enter. That's the quiet revolution of Metta. It doesn't shout. It doesn't punish. It simply holds space for the possibility of transformation, and it changes the one who offers it too. Science now confirms what sages knew centuries ago. People who regularly practice loving kindness experience lower anxiety, greater resilience, and deeper social connection. Their hearts, quite literally, grow stronger. But beyond the studies and charts, there's something even more valuable: a life lived without regret. A heart that knows, no matter how chaotic the world becomes, it remained kind. So how do we live this way? Start small. In your morning, before your phone, before the news, close your eyes and silently wish well for yourself. May I be happy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. Then think of someone you care for, a friend, a pet, a loved one. May they be happy. May they be safe. May they live with ease, and slowly expand, to a neighbor, a stranger, to someone who hurt you. Yes, even them, it will feel awkward, it might even feel impossible. That's okay. What matters isn't perfection, it's persistence. Like water wearing down stone, each act of kindness reshapes the world. And when you begin to live this way, not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as a flawed, hopeful human being, you'll notice something. The world softens. The strangers in traffic look less like enemies. The burden you carry feels a little lighter. And in the quiet of your own heart, a warmth returns you thought was lost. This is Metta. Not a grand philosophy, but a way of walking through the world with a heart that says, "May you be well." Not because you have to, not because you'll get something in return, but because you can. And because, in doing so, you remember who you really are. And as this gentle, fearless love takes root, it awakens another quality, one that deepens our connection to the suffering around us and calls us to respond, not with pity, but with fierce, tender courage. That, my friend, is where our path now leads. Some people believe that strength is measured by how much you can ignore, how many burdens you can carry without breaking, how skillfully you can turn away from the pain of others and keep moving forward. But the wisdom of the ancients whispers a different truth. It says real strength isn't the ability to look away. It's the courage to look closer. Compassion, or Karuna in the language of the old texts, is not a passive emotion. It's not pity and it's not soft. It's fierce. It takes guts. Because to practice true compassion is to willingly open your heart to the raw, aching suffering of this world, not to fix it all, not to save everyone, but to feel it, and to respond with tenderness where you can. Most of us, if we're honest, try to avoid this, not because we're heartless, but because we're exhausted. The constant noise of a world in crisis wears down even the kindest soul. It's easier to scroll past tragedy, to change the channel, to say, "It's not my problem." But somewhere deep within you, there's a knowing, a quiet voice that says, "Their pain is not separate from mine." The Buddha taught that suffering is universal. No one escapes it, not the rich, not the powerful, not even the wise. We are all bound by this shared human fragility, and it is precisely because of this that we must not harden. When you numb yourself to the suffering of others, you inevitably numb yourself to your own aliveness. Compassion asks us to stay open, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. It begins with seeing, not with your eyes, but with your presence. Noticing the woman holding back tears in the checkout line, the old man eating alone in a crowded cafe, the friend who laughs a little too loudly to cover the cracks in their heart. Compassion is not about solving their pain in an instant. It's about saying through your gaze, your words, your silence, "I see you, and you matter." And just like loving kindness, it starts within. Because if you refuse to meet your own sorrow, you'll struggle to meet anyone else's. It takes practice. Sit quietly sometime. Bring to mind a moment when you suffered. Really let yourself remember the ache, the loneliness, the fear, and then gently say to yourself, "It's okay. This too is part of being human." Notice how something softens in you. That's compassion awakening. And once you've touched that place, you begin to see it everywhere. In the refugee fleeing their homeland, in the addict numbing their pain, in the neighbor you've never spoken to who carries a grief you can't imagine. The world is full of invisible wounds, and when we dare to care, we become part of their healing. There's a famous story in Buddhist lore. A woman named Kisa Gautami lost her only child to illness. In her desperation, she carried the tiny body to the Buddha, begging him to bring her son back to life. The Buddha, with infinite compassion, told her he would, but only if she could find a house untouched by death. She searched the entire village, knocking on every door, and at every home she heard the same story. A father, a sister, a child, a friend, each household had known loss. At last, Kisa Gautami understood. Suffering is not personal, it's the nature of life. And in that realization, her grief transformed into compassion for all those who, like her, carried invisible sorrows. Compassion does this. It turns our wounds into bridges, our pain into connection, But make no mistake, it isn't weakness. The Dalai Lama often says, compassion is the radicalism of our time. To stay tender in a world that rewards hardness is an act of quiet rebellion. And here's the beautiful paradox. The more we open to the pain of others, the less alone we feel ourselves. Because somewhere in that raw, unguarded space, we remember, we're all just trying to find our way home. So how do we live with compassion without being crushed by the weight of the world? Start small. Notice suffering in the ordinary. A colleague stressed about a deadline, a stranger struggling with heavy bags, a friend hiding their heartbreak behind a smile. Offer what you can. A kind word, a silent blessing, a simple act of presence. And when the world's pain feels too big, too unfixable, place your hand on your heart and remember, you're not here to carry it all. You're here to let love move through you in whatever way you're able in this moment. Because each small act matters. Each gentle word ripples out further than you know. And when you live this way, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a human, you'll discover that compassion isn't a burden. It's a liberation. A reminder that in this fragile, fleeting life, the greatest courage is not to conquer, but to care. And when that care is born not from duty, but from genuine connection, it awakens another immeasurable quality, a joy. Not a giddy, surface happiness, but a deep, abiding gladness for the simple, beautiful fact that others exist and that you get to witness their light. And that is where our journey now takes us. If compassion teaches us to hold each other's suffering, sympathetic joy, Mudita, asks us to celebrate one another's happiness. And strangely, for many of us, this is even harder. It sounds simple, doesn't it? To be glad when someone else wins. To feel genuinely happy for their good fortune, to see a friend succeed or a stranger triumph and let your heart rise with theirs. But in truth, the human mind is a tricky thing. We live in a world wired for competition, for comparison, where someone else's gain can feel like our loss. And joy, their joy, can quietly stir envy, resentment, or a sharp ache of inadequacy. It happens in small, ordinary moments. A colleague gets the promotion you hoped for. A neighbor buys a bigger house. A friend finds love while you're still searching. And though you smile and offer congratulations, a part of you contracts. A whisper of "why not me?" An ache of "when will it be my turn?" This isn't because you're unkind. It's because you're human. But here's the quiet truth the ancient masters knew. If we only allow ourselves to be happy when we succeed, our joy will be rare and fragile, forever at the mercy of circumstances. But if we can learn to rejoice in the happiness of others, to let their good fortune lift us, even when our own lives feel empty, then joy becomes endless. It multiplies, it spreads, it transforms. Mudita is the antidote to envy, to comparison, to the scarcity mindset that whispers there's not enough good in this world for all of us. It says, your joy doesn't diminish mine, it expands it. And the beautiful paradox is this: the more you celebrate the light in others, the more you awaken your own. Sympathetic joy begins, like all great practices, in small moments. Pause for a second when you hear good news about someone else. Notice the immediate reaction in your body. Is it warmth, tightness, indifference? Whatever it is, don't judge it, just witness. Then quietly offer a simple inner blessing. May their happiness continue. May their joy grow. You don't have to force a feeling. The sincerity of your wish is enough. And over time, something beautiful happens. That tight grip of comparison loosens. That urge to measure your worth against others fades. You start seeing joy everywhere. In a child's laughter, in a couple's quiet tenderness, in the success of a stranger halfway across the world. And you realize joy isn't a limited resource. It's an infinite current. And every time you open to it in others, you tap into it within yourself. There's a story from the old texts about a disciple who struggled deeply with jealousy. Whenever someone else advanced on the spiritual path, he felt small and bitter. He couldn't stand to see others shine. The Buddha, wise as ever, didn't scold him. Instead, he asked the disciple to imagine a vast candle-lit hall. Each time another person lights a candle, the room grows brighter, and yet no one's flame diminishes. In fact, the more flames, the more warmth, the more light for all. Joy is like this. The light of another person's good fortune doesn't take anything from you. It adds to the radiance of the world you live in. And when you learn to rejoice sincerely in that light, your own heart becomes a steady flame, no longer flickering with every twist of fortune. But let's be honest, sympathetic joy isn't always easy, especially when you're in pain, when you've lost something precious. When life feels barren and others are blooming, it can feel almost cruel to be asked to celebrate their joy. And yet, sometimes in those darkest seasons, simply witnessing the happiness of another can remind you that light still exists, that the wheel of life turns, that sorrow and gladness are woven into this human tapestry, and one day the light will find you again. So if you can't rejoice yet, it's okay. Just don't close your heart. Stay present. Wish others well, even if your voice trembles, because every time you soften, you plant a seed. And one day that seed will blossom into a joy so deep it needs no reason. A joy that isn't dependent on your wins. A joy that isn't fragile, fleeting, or conditional, but steady, quiet, unshakable. The kind of joy the sages spoke of. The kind born from a heart no longer at war with the world. And this joy, this mudita, naturally gives rise to something even rarer. A calm, spacious equanimity. A mind that remains steady in both sorrow and delight. And that, my friend, is where our journey now gently turns. There's a kind of peace that isn't dependent on what happens. A quiet steadiness. A heart untouched by praise or blame, by gain or loss. A mind that remains clear whether the world is rising or falling. The ancient masters called this Upekkha, equanimity. And if the first three immeasurables, loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, are the tender arms of an awakened heart, then equanimity is its spine. It's what holds everything upright when the winds of life blow hard. Because no matter how kind we are, how much compassion we offer, how deeply we rejoice in the joy of others, life as it does will test us. A sudden illness, a betrayal you didn't see coming, a dream that crumbles, a love that fades, a world that, no matter how tightly you try to hold it, slips through your fingers. And in those moments, it's not sentimental hope or blind optimism that carries you through. It's equanimity, the deep, grounded knowing that everything rises and falls, that joy and sorrow, gain and loss, praise and blame, they all come and go like waves on the ocean. You don't control the tides, but you can learn to stand steady in the surf. This isn't cold detachment. It's not indifference. Equanimity isn't about shutting down your heart. It's about opening it so wide that it can hold both beauty and tragedy without breaking. It's the wisdom that says, this too belongs. The peace that comes not from escape but from full acceptance. A Zen saying puts it beautifully, let go or be dragged. And isn't that the truth? Most of our suffering doesn't come from what happens, it comes from our resistance to it. Our clinging, our desperate attempts to control a life that was never ours to command. We grip so tightly to how we want things to be that when life refuses to cooperate, as it often does, we crack. Equanimity invites us to loosen that grip, to feel fully but without drowning, to love deeply but without possessing, to care sincerely but without expectation, and perhaps most importantly, to trust that no storm lasts forever, that the waves will settle, that behind every cloud, the vast, open sky remains. There's a beautiful story about a monk who was once insulted, accused, and cast out by his own community. His name was Ryokan, a poet and a simple man, known for his playful spirit. When his home was stolen, he wrote, "The thief left it behind the clear night sky." And when someone asked how he could bear so much loss, he simply smiled and said, "When joy comes, I welcome it. When sorrow comes, I welcome that too." This is the art of equanimity. Not passivity, not apathy, but a fierce, tender resilience. It allows you to stay open in grief, knowing sorrow is not your enemy, It lets you savor joy without clinging, knowing it too will pass. Equanimity is the steady flame that doesn't flicker with every gust of wind. And here's the quiet miracle. The more you cultivate it, the more you realize how little control you truly need. That life moves according to its own mysterious rhythm. That fighting its tides only exhausts you, and that the deepest peace comes not from holding on, but from letting be. You can begin this practice like all others in the small, ordinary trials of daily life. Notice your reactions to praise and criticism, to success and failure, to getting your way and not. Observe the pull to grasp what feels good and to push away what hurts, and then gently pause, take a breath, and whisper to yourself, "This too will pass." It's not a dismissal, it's a remembering that no feeling is final, that no high or low defines you, that beneath every storm the ocean is still. With time, you'll find a different kind of confidence emerging, not the brittle armor of control, but the soft, steady strength of trust. The trust that you can face whatever comes, that your worth isn't tied to outcomes, that your peace doesn't depend on circumstances, and you'll begin to see others differently too, with more patience, more kindness, because you'll recognize their struggles as your own. This is what makes equanimity immeasurable. It holds the world without trying to fix it. It stands firm without hardening. And in a world of constant noise and clashing opinions, of highs and heartbreaks, a heart grounded in equanimity is a rare, luminous thing. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care wisely. And when you combine this calm wisdom with the boundless love, compassion, and joy we've already explored, something extraordinary begins to awaken in you. A way of being in the world that is both deeply engaged and perfectly free. And it is here, at the heart of this ancient path, that we find ourselves standing at the threshold of integration, not just understanding these four immeasurables, but living them, breathing them, letting them reshape how we show up in every moment. And that, dear one, is where our journey now turns. It's one thing to understand wisdom in words, to read about compassion, kindness, joy, and equanimity in sacred texts, to be moved by ancient teachings, feeling as if some forgotten truth has stirred awake inside you. But it's quite another to carry those truths into your everyday life, into the hum of alarm clocks, traffic jams, unanswered messages, difficult conversations, and quiet, lonely evenings. This is where the real practice begins, because it's easy to speak of loving kindness in a quiet room with incense burning. It's another matter entirely when someone cuts you off in traffic, when your partner forgets something important, when your heart feels brittle from too many disappointments. So how do we take these four immeasurables, these immeasurable qualities of the awakened heart, and weave them into the threads of ordinary days? The first step is remembering. Remembering that these qualities aren't distant ideals reserved for saints and sages. They live within you, waiting to be chosen. Every day offers hundreds of small moments to choose loving kindness, to pause and wish well to a stranger, to soften when your instinct is to snap, to send a silent blessing to someone struggling even if you don't know them. It doesn't have to be dramatic. A gentle smile when someone looks exhausted, a kind word to the cashier who seems lost in her own battle, an unspoken prayer for the driver weaving recklessly ahead of you. These small choices, repeated, become habits, and those habits shape a life. Compassion, too, can be practiced quietly. It's not always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's simply sitting with your own pain without turning away, letting yourself feel fully without shame or suppression. And then when someone else stumbles, your heart recognizes that terrain. You remember what it feels like to be lost, and your instinct is no longer to judge, but to reach out. Sympathetic joy might be the most challenging in a culture built on competition. How do you genuinely celebrate another's success when you're still waiting for your turn? How do you feel gladness for someone's joy when your heart feels empty? It begins, again, in small ways. Notice the green of jealousy when it arises, and instead of feeding it, pause. Whisper a quiet, sincere wish. May you be happy. May your joy continue. It might feel forced at first, but the heart softens with practice, and one day you'll find yourself smiling at someone's fortune with no trace of bitterness. And then equanimity, the steady flame. This one is perhaps the most subtle and the most powerful. It shows up in how you handle praise and blame, how you remain centered when plans fall apart, how you resist the urge to cling to what feels good and push away what hurts. And like the others, it's built in tiny, ordinary moments. When you notice yourself caught in a storm of thoughts, bring your awareness to the breath, anchor yourself in the now. Remember, this too will pass, and it will. Now let's be honest. This isn't easy. You will forget. You'll lose your temper. You'll catch yourself resenting someone's success. You'll find yourself clinging to things meant to pass, and that's okay. The path isn't about perfection. It's about returning. Again and again, you come back to your heart, to your breath, to your deepest intention. You forgive yourself quickly. You begin again. And in doing so, something miraculous happens. Slowly, the world feels less heavy. Your reactions soften. You move through life with more grace, not because everything has changed, but because you have. Even in chaos, you find moments of stillness. In the middle of noise, you hear the quiet hum of your own steady presence. And those around you notice. Not because you announce it, but because peace is contagious, because kindness leaves a trail, because a heart wide open makes others feel safe enough to open too. This is how ancient wisdom becomes modern life, not through lofty sermons or perfect postures, but through the simple, courageous act of remembering moment by moment to choose love over fear, compassion over judgment, joy over envy, and calm over chaos. And yes, you'll fall short. We all do. But the Four Immeasurables don't demand perfection. They invite you back gently every time you stray, and with each return the path becomes clearer. The heart grows steadier, and the immeasurable qualities of an awakened life stop being concepts and start becoming who you are. Not someone you pretend to be on good days, but the person you quietly, steadily become in the very middle of your beautiful, imperfect life. And as this transformation takes root, something else awakens, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, a sense of being a thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of human hearts, each one longing for the same things: peace, love, freedom, joy. And when you truly live this way, it's no longer just about your happiness. It's about the happiness of all beings. It's about becoming a small, steady light in a world that so desperately needs it. And that, my friend, is where our final reflection leads us. And so here we are. After walking hand in hand with ancient wisdom, after listening to the quiet murmur of the awakened heart, we arrive not at an ending, but at a return. Because the Four Immeasurables were never meant to be distant ideals written in old texts. They are the birthright of every human heart. Yours, mine, the restless, weary, beautiful hearts of the world. What began as ideas, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, now feel less like distant mountains to climb and more like old friends. Familiar, warm, real. And if you've made it this far, if you've sat with these teachings, allowed them to move something within you, you've already begun the most sacred transformation of all. The awakening of the boundless heart, a heart no longer shackled by fear or hardened by disappointment, a heart vast enough to hold both sorrow and joy, both the beauty and the ache of being alive, a heart that no longer waits for perfect circumstances to be kind or for the world to be quiet before it finds peace. And that changes everything. You start seeing differently. You notice the silent battles behind tired eyes. You feel tenderness where once there was irritation. You find yourself quietly wishing well to strangers you'll never meet. And in doing so, you soften the sharp edges of the world, not by force, but by presence. This is how a life is transformed, not with fireworks or grand epiphanies, but with small, steady, unnoticed acts of goodness. 1,000 invisible kindnesses, a steady breath when chaos surges, a quiet joy in someone else's light, a moment of letting go when your heart aches to cling, and slowly, You become a sanctuary, not just for yourself but for everyone who crosses your path. A quiet, steady presence in a world so often swept up in noise. This is the true gift of the Four Immeasurables. Not a promise of a life free from pain, but a heart strong enough, wide enough, still enough to meet whatever comes with grace. And now, before we part ways for now, I want to invite you to keep this conversation alive. If something in this journey touched you, if you felt seen, or softened, or inspired, I'd love for you to be part of this growing community of hearts. So take a moment, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Not for numbers, not for trends, but because when you do, you help spread these ancient, necessary truths into a world that desperately needs them. And leave me a comment below. Tell me which of the Four Immeasurables stirred something in you. Which one will you carry with you into tomorrow's ordinary moments? Because remember, this isn't the end. It's a return to yourself, to the quiet knowing you've carried all along, to a world that waits for hearts like yours. Until next time, may you be safe, may you be well, may you be peaceful, and may your boundless heart continue to awaken again and again. Subscribe for more wisdom. The path continues.